Hello and welcome to this companion podcast to the Reasoning in Organization Science webinar that we did a couple of days ago. I am Mikko Ketokivi and my colleague Saku Mantere is here with me. Good to see you again, Saku. And first of all, we are very impressed at the number of people who showed up, the quality of the discussions that we had and the comments we got. And there were indeed a lot of comments, which we will address in this follow-up podcast. But before we get into the specifics, Saku, let's reflect briefly on the session. What are the things that now that we've slept on it for a couple nights, what would you like to share with the audience in reflection?
Yeah, thanks, Mikko. I think one of the really encouraging things that I sensed, in particular when I was browsing through the comments, there were a lot. There was like 10 pages or more in the raw file of comments of different kinds. And it first of all, it seems that there's quite a bit of interest and autonomy in people in trying to figure out, the basis for good reasoning. So there are lots of junior scholars and senior scholars, obviously, as well. But sort of in particular, I saw that there were a lot of junior scholars who are interested in figuring stuff out rather than following rules, which I find incredibly encouraging. And it's also sort of something that's even, I have to say that it's a bit surprising, because sometimes it's easier to get a bit discouraged when you get asked these questions about how many interviews do I need to do to pass my thesis, and kind of this kind of assurance seeking. And it seems that sort of people are really thinking hard about how to get to the bottom of things, which is, I guess, that the overall sentiment that we're trying to promote. So that was my
Well, actually, that was my interpretation. I was really positively encouraged. So there were many comments in the chat box saying, "Oh, I'm confused, and this is really complicated." And I think it's a good thing. I think confusion is better than certainty, because certainty is ill-founded. So if you found yourself saying, "Okay, I may need to rethink some of the rules that I have been exposed to," that's exactly where I hope that a student and a young scholar would be, to say, you know what, I have to do the reasoning myself. I'm the person who understands the context and the data. So reading the methodology literature and reading the philosophy literature is an excellent idea. It's a great idea, but we have to be very careful with how we read. I love philosophical texts, but my relationship with the text has changed over the years. I don't look for guidance anymore. I used to look for guidance, but most of those searches for guidance were simply dead ends. And that's a sentiment I would like to convey here as well, that there are answers to these questions, but they require explicit reasoning and careful contextualization. And I think that's going to echo in this conversation as well.
Yeah, and I guess sort of I was thinking about, I was doing Wordle this morning again before I was getting ready for this meeting with my coffee, and there is an element of doubt in trying to figure out, that it's not necessarily all pleasant when you're really racking your brain to come up with a good hypothesis in Wordle, but there's also an excitement, and it's a little bit like exercise, that sort of, it's of course easier to stay home and watch TV, but sort of once you get out there and you go out on a jog or whatever, sort of just the sheer endorphin rush. And so the doubt thing is not necessarily a bad thing, even though it's kind of unpleasant, but it also sort of, there's a silver lining. And that's actually, for me, what makes research worth doing, figuring stuff out.
Yeah.
So it's really exciting.
Yeah, I found, I'll just share an anecdote. I played Wordle this morning as well. And I found I think it was my second or third guess. And I decided to intentionally enter a word that broke one of the rules. Why? Because I thought of a word that had the most common vowels. So I thought, okay, I'm going to break the rule. So I know this is not the right word, but I think that I'm going to get useful information out of it. Yeah, so that was so I think the Wordle, we have to be careful with so-called toy problems, taking a simple example. But both the beans in the bag example and the Wordle example are not to be taken literally. I mean, they're more like food for thought. Hey, here's an introduction of an idea. And I think the distinction between IOE and IBE can really effectively be made with Wordle. So I think that's a pedagogical value of starting with something simple and then moving toward the more complex. But suppose I had shown the Schwinn example in slide number 1. I think that would have been, kind of pushing people into the deep end of the pool right away. I think the audience may have been even more confused if we had started with a really complex question.
Yeah, and I guess, Wordle is really, it's an analogy of the reasoning process.
Exactly.
Analogies, as we and there's stuff about lenses and analogies in the comments. I think all analogies, they by definition they have their boundaries, so they're not an analogy isn't identical to the topic that is trying to
precisely.
That's the whole point.
That's the whole point. Yes, when we use the nexus of contracts analogy to look at organizations, to look at contracting, we're not saying that the firm is a nexus of contracts. We're saying there could be some value in thinking of the firm as if it were. Okay, and incidentally, I was just working on a chapter of my upcoming book. See how I insert shameless marketing plugs into this recording? So I was just writing about anti-takeover protection for one of the chapters of my upcoming book, Efficient Organization. And to understand anti-takeover protection, understanding the nexus of contracts perspective is really useful. It's really useful as you're asking the question, who in the organization requires protection? It's not the organization that requires protection, but it's some parts of it. And that's where the nexus of contracts analogy is really useful in bringing into focus the question. Okay.
Yeah. Sure. All right. So maybe we should jump into the first one. So the first one, I think the first category was about the little JPEG that we showed in the beginning about complex and right and simple and wrong. And I think it triggered a really interesting discussion. It also, I think it's worth clarifying what we were looking for with that.
Yes.
So, I get the sentiment that simple explanations in research often are ultimately what we end up with, in particular when we go with physics analogies, like somebody cited Feynman and so on. So obviously some of the greatest discoveries in theory developments in all science have been really elegant and simple rules. However, I guess what we were after here was we're going to talk about reasoning. So the example is that the reasoning process that leads to a simple rule is rarely very simple. So there are lots of dead ends. There's a lot of anxiety. There's a lot of doubt, at least, and sort of that was kind of the sentiment of it, rather than to say that all good. I guess that that the misleading part about the JPEG was that it's answers, simple and right, complex and wrong. So perhaps the selection of that picture, so it can be misleading, but still the sentiment that we're trying to propose that if you look around you, when people talk about, for instance, celebrities talk about doing their own research on vaccines. And what happens then when you sort of when somebody does their research without the natural science degree online to come up with the answers that are available nowadays, I guess that was the sentiment of the picture.
Precisely. Yeah. The idea that when you think of the reasoning process, and I think there might be it might be useful maybe to do another webinar on the question, what are the implications for doctoral education? So suppose we take seriously this. So again, let me briefly return to the question, what should my sample size be? We can think of many ways of reasoning about it, but
Yeah.
simple ways of reasoning about sample size are guaranteed. I'm not going to use the word right and wrong. Let me instead use the word plausible or credible or accepted by the audience. So think of the pre-examination of your doctoral dissertation or the peer review process. If in the peer review process that you follow the rule that sample size has to be at least 200, in all likelihood, that claim is not going to be accepted because it's a simplistic view of thinking about the inferential aspects of statistical modeling. So what do we need to take into account? We need to take into account the model complexity, for instance. We need to take into account also, there are things that we don't know before we decide what the sample size is. So we have to, so this is kind of, we don't know all the rules. So one of the rules that we don't know what the distribution of our variables is going to be. Okay, so if the distributions are really nice mount shaped or approximate normal distributions, then sample size requirements are usually lower than they are if the variables exhibit really strange behavior in the distribution sense. So this was the notion that a simple answer is not necessarily wrong, but just not credible.
Yeah, and sort of I think, and we're going to be talking about doctoral education perhaps in a further webinar, but sort of just perhaps the sentiment that when I teach qualitative methods, I do not teach them in isolation of actual empirical studies.
So I don't either. Yeah, I do the same. I do the exact same with quantitative methods. That's a very good point.
So these types of answers, the complex answers are embedded in the context of what's being studied. And I guess that's the sentiment. Maybe a couple of words about Occam's razor. That so Willem of Occam was a medieval nominalist philosopher who introduced the principle that you shouldn't be in your, I guess what we would nowadays call a theoretical model or theoretical explanation. You shouldn't use more abstract entities than is absolutely necessary. So this is the principle, and often sort of it's been bastardized into saying that the simpler explanation is the correct one, but it's not that Occam actually sort of claimed that it was the correct one. It's just a principle. It's that's the loveliest explanation for Occam, and which has been shared by many scholars. So it's a sentiment ultimately. There is nothing in some transcendental sense that makes a simpler answer more correct than a complex one.
Exactly.
So that's universally speaking, there's so this deals with aesthetics. It deals with people's cognitive limitations and so on, and we can of course then in the philosophy of mathematics there are all sorts of debates about where do sort of mathematical rules come from, and are they just human sort of constructions, or are they intuitions that are about something else? It's I have to say that I'm not smart enough to take a stand there, but I know that for Occam there is no convincing argument that somehow the simpler answer is the correct one. It's a principle that we follow.
Exactly. So when Piyush says that Occam's razor has no empirical proof, I guess that's an accurate statement. That it's not.
Absolutely. It wasn't an empirical, and also sort of what we call empirical science nowadays. It hadn't been invented yet. So that's the type of stuff that emerges with the Enlightenment and so on.
Yeah,
but anyway,
So let me just briefly, Phil Bromley, who is a colleague and friend at UC Irvine, he has a very down-to-earth way of thinking about this. So I think that all of us probably subscribe to the idea of bounded rationality. The decision makers are boundedly rational, but whenever I have a theoretical conversation with Phil and bounded rationally comes up, he says, "Do we need it for anything?" do we need it for anything in the argument? And it may turn out that even though we subscribe to bounded rationality, it has no role in the specific argument. So I think that's a very good way of thinking about, don't introduce things that you don't need for anything. And, you know, I think we have a tendency of putting more stuff into our theories than is necessary. So I think that advice from Phil has resonated with me for a long time.
That's great. That's great. And sort of I can sense that there are so many links to what we're going to be talking about later, but I'm kind of containing myself and waiting for us to move to the next topic.
Okay. Shall we move on to templates? Let's talk about templates. So
so I think these comments come from the stage where you had this Danny Joya quote, and you had people guess who it was, and sort of Joya it's a really great example, I think, of scholarship that is just that in the, I guess it was late 80s when he started pioneering this approach to doing qualitative studies, and he was one of the first scholars to publish qualitative research in strategic management journals. So he was really kind of a front runner. In the same sense that Eisenhardt was with her papers, that they managed to kind of actually get a lot of visibility by really sort of constructing a very compelling way of doing work with qualitative studies. And with Joya, he created, I think he was in particular successful in sort of creating powerful visualizations and sort of powerful argument structures, for what was more or less an interpretive method. Whereas Eisenhardt, I find that she's more leaning towards scientific realism, but sort of, Danny Joya's method or sort of methodology is much more leaning towards an interpretivist way but it's funny that I think, he never wanted his style. I would actually sort of call it almost like a style, what he does in drawing a data structure and then sort of, assuring that there's continuity from the data structure, from those concepts to the theoretical model, process model, often what he presents. And it is very elegant. But he never intended people to follow him as
exactly.
Following. I think it's great that we have these inspirational examples, but really, and sort of I'm also going to go a bit further. I wouldn't say that templates are necessarily a negative thing per se. I think they are, when properly understood, they can be very powerful ways of kind of forging cognitive, kind of crossing cognitive boundaries between evaluators and scholars, that, they're recognizable and they do things very effectively. But of course, the challenge there is that there's not that many of them in the first place. So their limitations are significant. And sort of, like I think Joop Cornelissen, I'm looking at my Amsterdam mug that he actually brought me as a gift to. So Joop has been sort of, pushing, as well as Anne Langley and others, for kind of appreciating the fact that, in particular, qualitative research has all these different traditions that are incredibly rich, and they allow us to look into different kinds of contexts. And what templates tend to do is that they sort of really limit our options if our imagination ends there. And ultimately, they don't reason for us. So that's also what.
And you're a better expert on qualitative templates, but my understanding is that they are rooted in research practice. That's why they're diverse. That's why they're idiosyncratic. Might it make sense here so when Danny Joya said, my approach is not a method, it's a methodology. Might we clarify what he means by what's the distinction?
Yeah, I think, it's interesting. There's not. So methodology is a way of thinking about how to do research, and it's a tradition, in which it's almost like a discussion between scholars who have had different approaches to studying something. And then a method is something that you apply. A method is a tool. So I would say that a structural equation model, as far as I understand, that's a method that you can apply a mathematical framework to a certain problem. Yes. But then when we talk about methodology, we talk about more general principles. In Joya's case, I think a lot of the methodology is almost like an aesthetic. So he has a certain, which is I think also true of Eisenhardt, that she is so compelling because she has a very, very compelling way of writing. Presenting results
absolutely.
and parsing them into tables, and it's almost like Danny Joya's methodology is in some sense a visual style that he's pioneered himself, based on, of course, he's incredibly well read, so he's read into social science, and I guess both Eisenhardt and Joya take a different spin on grounding theory, which is something that Glaser and Strauss, two sociologists, developed to understand. I guess it was elderly care that they studied in that. Do you remember what they studied?
They looked at specific empirical context, and they also made the distinction between formal theory and what they called substantive theory. That substantive theory is, a substantive. What if we want to theorize juvenile delinquency? It's really hard to present a formal theory of juvenile. It has to be more of what they call a substantive theory. So it's rooted in the empirical context. So, but absolutely. So an econometric model or a structural equation model is a method. And that is applied in the context of what I would call theory testing methodology. So theory testing methodology is this basic idea that you take your theoretical structure and you derive empirical predictions from it. That's kind of the methodology. Like you said, it's a good way of framing. Methodology is the way of thinking about something and not about the specific tools. But certainly there are many ways of thinking about theory testing methodology. And like we said, this idea of hypothetico-deductive is a misnomer because it elevates deduction to a position where it really doesn't belong.
Yeah, when you said that you derive empirical predictions from your theory, that's it's important to say derive rather than deduce, even though
exactly. So there's translation that goes on. So there's probably deduction, induction, but in a very significant role, abductive reasoning, which is always translation, right? Okay, so if you translate innovativeness into research and development intensity, you can't deduce the R&D budget from the concept of innovation. If you look at the definition of innovation, it doesn't suggest that you need to look at some accounting measure.
I do not know that, for instance, you have sort of same kinds of stuff that we read outside the the main academic literature where we look at it, like we both read by Danny Kahneman. We both read Phil Tetlock's studies and prediction, and many of these really brilliant scholars who really helped us understand fundamental phenomena. I think one of their brilliance is founded in the way that they design experiments and research designs, and there's nothing deductive. I think it would be very insulting to say that Danny Kahneman deduced his experiments from psychological theory as if he's some kind of a robot, but he got the Nobel Prize in economics, or that's Svenska Riksbankens, but some people are like it's called Nobel. But anyway, so he's been lauded by the economics community, even though he's a psychologist, because he's managed to create these wonderful experiments. That's not deductive. That's abductive and sort of human ingenuity and
creative. Kruger and Dunning come to mind as well. People who really, and John Antonakis at Lausanne, who is very skilled at who turns charisma into an exogenously manipulated variable in an experiment by hiring actors. I mean that it's just it's not deduction. It would be completely misguided to call these things, but of course deductive reasoning is involved in this as well. Okay, shall we move on to theory? So now we have theory, and by the way, we have shown the people's first names here, so we thought that for confidentiality, we'll just show first name. So if you see your first name, you can say, hey, I'm here, I'm featured here.
At this point, I sort of, if in some if somebody doesn't see their question, don't be don't be offended. There were a lot of them, so we had to do a bit of selection, and also some of them were perhaps a bit harder to understand. So there may have been really brilliant points, but it was in this one sentence, we wanted to be more or less sure that we could understand the question. So but anyway,
so
this is actually theory structure and theory. So when I think that there's this I think this is an interesting question. Are theories the only way to explain something? Well, no, not necessarily. There's explanation in language use has all sorts of instances, and scholarly explanation where theories are used typically, or maybe engineering uses theory as well. But there are lots of you can explain you can give yourself an explanation in a supernatural explanation if you're religious, and sort of that's not theory, but that's something else, I suppose.
Yeah, so yeah, we might ask, what does it mean to explain something? And I'm kind of a meat and potatoes guy. I think that, in my line of work, and when I again think of my own training in organization economics, to explain something is to explain why something happens. Is that, think of the Schwinn example again. Why did Schwinn engage in vertical restraints? So the theory is, so the efficiency argument was couched in transaction cost economics, and it says the interpretation it gives, the explanation it gives is Schwinn did what it did because it wanted to engage in efficient contracting. So there is this, I think David Whetton in the 1989 AMR article had kind of his idea of theoretical explanation was specifically that it answers the why question. But of course, that's not the only way. That's not the only way.
Charles Tilly, the sociologist, has a book called Why ? Which is actually looking into, I think he's studying 7 different forms of explanation in ordinary language use. So, and say that I feel elated because I went to a great jazz concert yesterday. So that's an explanation why I feel elated, but it has nothing to do with theory.
Exactly. Yeah.
There are theories on, but in scholarly discourse, theories do have a very special role. And I think this is also, we've seen journals who've noted, like Andy van de Ven, who also was in the seminar. So he's been pioneering Academy of Management Discoveries, a new journal which is trying to be a bit more agnostic about sort of theorizing that you can have an empirical contribution. I think SMJ, Strategic Management Journal, nowadays also sort of expresses in their editorial policy that they don't require a theoretical contribution necessarily if you have a strong empirical contribution, which is, and I find this exciting, interesting, and I'm still looking forward to seeing some other types of contributions. I think we are very, very heavily dependent on what we call a theoretical contribution.
Well, although to me it's always been elusive what theoretical contribution is. So again, my simple way of thinking about this is, are you saying something non-obvious? To me, that's the essence of a contribution. Are you telling your audience something non-obvious, something that, remember Murray Davis's article, that's interesting. So he says that a claim is interesting when it challenges some of the predispositions or beliefs that your audience currently has. And then there are many ways. There are many ways of engaging an audience and challenging them. So theoretical contribution has always, it continues to be elusive too.
Yeah, it's interesting actually, and that the positivists had a lot to say about it when they were sort of active in their program. And I guess historically speaking, theory goes back all the way back to the invention of science as we understand it. So in the sort of around 500 BC in Greece, in the Greek kind of civilization, you had philosophers who developed a method of studying reality which was not mythical. So they were sort of giving up on kind of transcendental explanations, and sort of in particular the influence of Socrates and then his students. For them, theoria, which is the Greek word, it actually means to behold or to see. So for them, it almost meant like an activity of trying to witness the basic uninterrupted, like Plato's cave metaphor and everything. So they were trying to see through confusions in language and perception into reality. And sort of that was there and often in a dialogical process. So for instance, Plato wrote his work as dialogues. So it was a way of engaging in science. So it was almost like what scientists did. And scientists were philosophers for the most part in those days. So they did theoria. They were and nowadays we have all sorts of expectations about what theory and what is it not, and of course even in our field there have been debates about it.
Yeah. So let me pick up on Nicole's point. The journal publishing process tends to prefer certainty as opposed to uncertainty. I'm not sure I would use the word certainty and uncertainty, but certainly manuscripts must be coherent. And if you read a hypothesis testing study, you see a linear progression of the argument, but that hardly is a description of the process that the researcher or the co-authors went through. So yes, every act of writing a manuscript is an act of reconstruction. It can't be, you can't show all your processes in all their messiness and dead ends and iterations. So what do you think? How would you react to Nicole's point that journals prefers? What do they prefer in fact?
Yeah, and ultimately this might be because I have tenure nowadays. I am not fighting for my life when I'm working with my research. So in a sense, perhaps I'm approaching this from a bit of a lofty place, and I have to be self-critical about this. But for me, the focus on what the journal wants, it's just something a bit it concerns me that people are, and in particular when people are doing revisions and that they're trying to anticipate what the reviewers would want them to do. And I have to admit that sort of, actually, I have never, even when I was young, I never sort of went that way. So I've always read the kind of the editorial letters with an intent of sort of trying to figure out what was wrong in my paper. And sort of, is there a way, can I get some inspiration into finding that the next more, typically you have to actually, select a different explanation with qualitative work. The first explanation that you submit rarely is the one that you publish, which is kind of interesting. Yeah. It shifts. And sort of, it's not that reviewer one wants me to pursue this explanation, and reviewer 3 prefers an identity story, and reviewer 1 prefers a culture story, and now I have to find a way of incorporating both, or sort of apologizing to one so that I can follow to the other. I've never really thought in those terms. So for me, it's more like sort of is there a way for me to make this argument better, or the type of criticism that they're providing, what are the main weaknesses in my paper, not necessarily in what they say, but can I actually use what they say to figure out how to make this better? Yeah. And I think, but of course I have a lot of sympathy for people who are in, when you're in a tenure track, when you're assistant or you're kind of getting ready for, of course you want to make it. And I have to be callous not to sympathize with that. But I think it's a challenge that we have to face, that ultimately, we have to present the best argument that we humanly can. The reviewers and the editor won't or know our work nearly as well as we do. So, they don't have the chance to see through it. Yeah. But then also there's another comment by Venkataraman about, how word limits and sort of, templates are required. After witnessing the publishing of qualitative research for around 20 years now, I think there is a lot of agnosticism towards a simple sort of, copying of a template now. I don't think it flies with many reviewers these days. So that there is space for you to present an argument structure that's not identical with somebody else's.
No, I agree that let's engage in a little bit of logical reasoning. So will templates get you published? They have, and they probably still do, but it doesn't mean that if you don't adopt a template, you won't get published. It's a non sequitur. So, in my case, that, like I said, I've done case studies with 35 cases, not half a dozen, 35. And then in the manuscript, you just have to take the reader by the hand and show them why this research design makes sense. So we really want to avoid hasty generalizations and non sequiturs as we're thinking about this. I've been in review processes where myself and my co-authors, we have felt the pressure to conform to a template, but we have resisted every single time, and those articles have gotten published. So I really want to emphasize this, that the fact that templates work doesn't mean that something else doesn't work. And finally, maybe a final point to this idea of that what journals want, that may ultimately be an anthropomorphic fallacy. Journals are organizations. I was the editor-in-chief of Journal of Operations Management, and in my 3 years as the editor, I never thought that the journal wants anything. No, we are maybe a nexus of contracts thinking might be really useful. There are multiple layers in the organization of a journal, and then it's a luck of the draw who ends up as a reviewer, as an associate editor. So this idea of trying to think really hard in advance what the journal wants, I think that's misguided energy.
Yeah, but then, so then there are unfair things that happen. We're all humans. There's an incredible pressure on the journals to process papers, and mistakes happen. And we all have our hard luck stories of not getting published. So sometimes it ain't fair, but sort of ultimately. So there was a time when we published an AMJ in 2012, where we really sort of, we approximated the Joya style very closely, and it even got mentioned in in Joya's organizational research methods paper as an example of kind of applying that methodology. I know, say, Mike Pratt's Amway paper has a data structure that looks a little bit, as I recall, or a table that looks a little bit like Joya, and it is one of the best anthropological theses that I know in the field still. So it's one of my absolute favorites. So there are sort of different ways of engaging and sort of making what you're doing somewhat recognizable by that. Yeah. But then there's a lot of qualitative papers that are published that actually have a style that probably looks a little bit like my own. So they're I used frequencies to kind of do descriptive statistics on what the data looks like, and then sort of get into a more interpretive mode. And they, again, sort of, it's a different way, and that has flown, so that has been published. So it depends on really what you want to do. But when somebody says that working with Wittgenstein or Popper to clarify the method, I think, I've read a lot of Wittgenstein, and I still struggle a lot to understand what he's trying to say. But using Wittgenstein to clarify anybody's method, I think that would be a pretty hard thing to do.
And I would say the very same thing about Popper. There's nothing that Popper wrote that would ever clarify anything that you've done in terms of research. We need to understand that these Popper wrote his text not to empirical researchers, but to other philosophers. And often, like, we make the distinction between normative and prescriptive, he was dealing with normative questions that are just painfully detached from. I see a lot of people paying lip service to Popper, but that doesn't, it confuses more than it clarifies. It really does. So and the assumption that we can just pick up Popper, we have no training in philosophy, but that we could pick up one of the main books of one of the biggest names in philosophy of science of the 20th century and assume that it was written for us. There's something a little pretentious, I think, about
Yeah, I think, well,
this.
you know, and what I saw in the UK was this critical realism movement, which actually mentioned in the webinar, and people just basically reading a single book by, you know, whomever from that tradition.
Yeah, Margaret Archer's tome is one of them. I had it, I read it, and I finally said I'm giving up because I don't see a connection to what I do when I go to work Monday morning. So I don't know. I think we should be proud of our own heritage and what we do and say, hey, as long as I can present a coherent argument, I don't need any isms or ologies, you know, to bolster that, you know.
Personally, I found Wittgenstein to be much more interesting, you know, from a theoretical perspective when I study discourse, or if I study you know, Jeff Lowenstein and I have a project on vocabularies in the organizations, and sort of, you know, for those sorts of things, I know Wittgenstein is a bit more interesting, and sort of Popper is super fascinating.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I love Opus.
To clarify anything, I don't know in particular in terms of method. Well, I'll believe it when I see it.
But I love Open Society and its enemies, and I love Paul Feyerabend's Against Method. It is just, it is really compelling and interesting and food for thought. But there's no prescription. If you read Feyerabend, he says anything goes. Okay, excellent. So I think that we all need to, if you're interested in philosophy, develop your own relationship with the philosopher. My relationship has certainly changed a lot over the past 25 years. I read Popper still, but very differently. Kuhn is the same. Kuhn, who is a historian, not a methodologist, a historian. So his writings on paradigms and normal science, they're compelling ideas, but again, painfully removed from what we do in practice. Okay, this is turning out to be, it's going to be a 3-hour.
Let me just react to one more thing before we move on, because there's this notion of theory structure, and Andy van der Ven noted that actually there was a paper in 1965 by Gerald Haig in ASQ. And Mikko, you also sort of at some point you referred to this paper by who kind of, you know, reconstructed pop ecology as an axiomatic system. Do you remember that reference?
Yeah, there's, I want to say, American Sociological Review or American Journal of Sociology. So yeah, this idea that there are ways of theorizing about organizations that take an axiomatic basis of, so kind of start with first principles and then work from there. So organizational ecology is one. I think structural contingency. I want to say that Gerald Hage, Aiken and Hage, the work that they did was largely on organizational structures. So they start with kind of the basic principles and then they derive propositions from those principles. So this notion of axiomatic theory is it's probably not axiomatic the same way it would be considered in mathematics, but this idea of starting with first principles. Yes.
Yeah. So, and it, you know, I think to comment on that is that I mentioned the axiomatic conception of theory because it would be required if as a first principle, if we could even use deduction to derive predictions from theory. That a theory would have to have a hierarchical structure. And actually Popper in Logic of Scientific Discovery, he talks about sort of, how he gives an example. He's not very clear on whether it's necessary, but it seems that, kind of thinking through it, how else could it be possible to deduce anything from theory if the theory doesn't have first principles from which are more general than some other principles. So in that sense, it would seem to require that. And sort of what's really important to understand here is that, yes, there are these reconstructions that people have done sometimes. And once you go into individual models, you have a theoretical model. Often a theoretical model will have a structure that looks something like an axiomatic structure. There are more general variables, and then there are more sort of particular variables. But theory per se, management theory, is not axiomatic. I haven't, it's narrative, arguably. So, in philosophy of science nowadays, they speak that there are like three conceptions of scientific theories: the syntactic, semantic, and pragmatic. And the syntactic conception is that the theories are really kind of, written in logic in this, and then they can be translated into the actual mathematical models. Then there's the semantic theory, which is basically saying that theories are collections of mathematical models, that they don't have this a priori structure. And then the pragmatic conception is that there's a lot of different stuff that happens in theory, like in the use of language, that you have this syntactic, grammar, you have semantics, what words are referring to, and then you have pragmatic. So how is it, and this is where kind of a Wittgensteinian perspective comes in, how is it that words and expressions are used in everyday life? What are the language games? What are the forms of life where they're rooted in? And I guess sort of for me, it's self-evident that sort of, if you look at what gets published in our journals, they look nothing like the syntactic
I'm precise. Okay, let me briefly tackle the last and Diwakar's. Is it necessary for a conceptual paper to have a theoretical lens? My knee-jerk reaction is yes, that a conceptual paper has to have theoretical content. It's hard for me to think of a conceptual paper that would be of interest to me if it didn't adopt some kind of a theoretical lens.
I would sort of, I would say that, it's in some cases, some theory papers, they integrate several theoretical lenses.
But there has to be Kathy Eisenhardt's article on organizational boundaries that goes through four different theoretical lenses. It's one of the best conceptual papers I've read, and I use it in my teaching.
Kind of the subtle semantics of the sentence is that it isn't necessary for it to have only one theoretical.
Absolutely.
But to have a conceptual paper that didn't have any sense of a theoretical lens, what would that look like? I don't know. In particular, conceptual paper. So you don't have any data to fall back on. So what are you contributing then?
Yeah, and I also think of theory in a very abstract sense as a conversation. Theory as conversation, theory gives us vocabulary, it gives us logic, it gives us concepts. So without theory, how can we have a conversation? How can we have a conversation if we just say, hey, look at this correlation, hey, look at this one? Empirics without theory is just, theories organize our thoughts in a very, very fundamental way. Okay, let's see. And by the way, as you can see, I haven't blurred Andy's last name, because if the
he might not mind. Yeah,
I don't think he minds, and his identity is relevant here, and that sense. I think Alf is another person whose name I didn't blur. Okay, let's briefly going back to this toy problem. Is there anything about Persis beans in the back that we might want to revisit? If we have many bags.
My USB gates are a bit unstable. Anyway, so the toy problem. I think Andy's point about Randall Collins and the fact that the sociological theory, tends to be able to incorporate several dominant perspectives at the same time, so that there are. So is that the notion that is abduction founded on a pluralistic view of theory? So it's a really sort of, it's interesting because abduction happens in a much smaller scale. So we do abduction, at least it's possible to do it, at the level of a single experiment, a single, your field study, and there's a bet that really doesn't make sense. The CEO says something that seems really stupid and dangerous, and you don't get why that would happen, or that the CEO says something and there's a widespread resistance in the organization. Like, this is how organizational identity, I think, it got invented by Albert and Webber. They were seeing a university that was resisting a change that seems self-evidently positive for the organization in many ways. So why? So is it that this kind of requires us to think of theory in pluralistic terms? The explanation can be something that's much more substantive, as you said, like Laser and Strauss, that perhaps it's much closer to the data. But would it be possible to think of abduction if there's just one main theory? That's it for me. I've sort of just grown up in this field for such a long time, and it's so easy to take it as granted that there will be different research programs that are competing.
And certainly you can take any given questions like organizational boundaries, and can we have multiple well-reasoned theories? Yes, we can. So we can have an efficiency theory, we can have a power theory, a competence theory, and an identity theory. Why did Disney divest Miramax back in the day? Interesting question that can be approached from different perspectives. And I don't know, somebody might say that identity perspective is really compelling because Miramax, that produced movies like Pulp Fiction, very violent movies, maybe they said at Disney, you know what, we don't want to do this. Okay, maybe for the same reason would Disney do pornography if it was really lucrative. No, that it's just not. It's not about efficiency of contracting. It is about, this is not who we are. And I can imagine the same thing with universities. What do universities do? And so there's certainly the question of identity. So yeah, we can have multiple well-reasoned theories to address any question. And the point that I made was that if we have fundamentally different incommensurate theories, there's really no methodological way we could ever compare them. So they may compete for attention. But to say that this theory is empirically more adequate than that one, when the two are founded on very different assumptions and they don't necessarily even try to explain the same thing. How could I compare them and say this is better than something else in any other than maybe aesthetic and this notion of loveliness that we talked about? So yeah, we do compare theoretical explanations, but typically not in the methodological sense.
Yeah, and then there's of course then there's the situation that we might, when we have an experimental setting, so we have to commit to certain assumptions earlier. So the selection between the bags happens earlier in the process.
Yes.
And there's something to be said that perhaps you should lock in your assumptions and not do data mining when sort of the experiment doesn't work. So perhaps there's some value in having some rigor in publishing and a rigorous test of something. But then the selection of what you're going to do when you're designing the experiments that happens, then there has to be some selection that you do.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move on.
Okay, let's leave the beans. Okay, here we go. Positivism. Let me get the whole thing here. So you are the you are the resident philosopher. So I just want to make, we need to make a distinction between positivism and positivism in quotation marks. I think, so why don't you tell us what positivism is, and then I'll tell us what I think positivism in quotes means.
Also, the positivism was originally, I think, it was I guess Auguste Comte was the founder of sociology in many ways. So he envisioned a view of social science which would be based on, rather than assumption or kind of implicit ideology, if you will, but sort of really sort of results that are robust and proven to be the case. So positive explanations. And then this label was picked up by a group called the Vienna Circle in the early 20th century, really sort of a powerhouse of an intellectual movement that had many links to thinkers like Wittgenstein and Einstein and so on. There's actually a great book about it just published called the Murder of Professor Schlick, which I really recommend everybody to look into. But the positivist tradition then, it was one of the most exciting philosophical programs because they really rigorously examined the assumptions that they made, and they basically discredited each and every one of their main assumptions.
Exactly, and then committed an honorable suicide in what, 1930s?
In a sense, but on the other hand, many of their key sentiments, like the appreciation of logic as a device for understanding philosophical problems, the closeness of philosophy to natural science in particular, although sort of many of them were social scientists actually. Sort of it's not that they they were just having physics envy. They also sort of had a much more pluralist background than we often think about. But then I guess what remains in American analytical philosophy, as we call it, sort of there was almost like a cross-pollination between the pragmatist tradition that existed in North America once many of these positives actually then emigrated to the United States before the Second World War. That even though the principles of positivism don't exist anymore, this kind of a sentiment exists.
Exactly.
That colors a lot of what philosophers at least do.
Yeah,
and positivism in management. Would you like to talk about what positivism is management?
Maybe one more thing for the record. Popper was not a positivist, in my understanding.
Yeah, he actually claimed that he was actually one of the murderers or the executioners of positivism. There's a bit of a debate out there whether actually sort of he. One assumption is that he actually would have wanted to be much closer to the Vienna Circle, but they didn't like him because
they didn't like him.
So he didn't get invited. So that might be a psychological story that's a little bit more complex, which you can read about it in the Murder of Professor Schlick book. But anyway, sorry.
So let me take this positivism and before I do that, there's a wonderful article by Michna Moldavanu and Joel Baum on positivism, and they state the obvious. No one has ever been or even tried to be a positivist. So positivist, without the quotation mark, no one has ever even tried to be in the methodological sense. But I guess this positivism in quotes is essentially what we call quantitative theory testing research. So you present.
There's Lex Donaldson though, who has been a self-confessed positivist, I believe, in our field. So he's. But with a few examples, that's the black swan. But very few people are self-confessed positivists.
Okay, I've read Lex Donaldson's book and said there's nothing that resembles positivism aside from his admission that he is one.
Okay.
So this idea of positivism, so this idea that we take an a priori theoretical structure And then we derive, again, not going to use the word deduce, we derive empirical predictions from that using all kinds of processes, translation, contextualization. And then we take a large data set and then we use statistical inference to test those hypotheses. And then depending on whether they are supported or not, we then draw conclusions about the theoretical foundation. Now, of course, this has absolutely nothing to do with positivism without quotation marks. And I'm not entirely sure what the history of the word positivism in organizational scholarship is, but it's a painfully misleading word to use. So read it was in the Blackwell Companion to Organizations, the Moldovanu and Baum article.
Yeah, 2002. Yeah.
2000. So it really merits reading. But let me try to capture kind of the sentiment from Kay's comment here. The discussion that we had on reasoning and the structure of argumentation, were we leaning toward any specific ism or ology in that conversation?
So that's the thing here, that I think it's very important to appreciate that reasoning is something that we do anyway. If we want to figure something out, and regardless of our kind of background assumptions or commitments in terms of intellectual traditions or philosophical schools of thought or research programs, we do need to use all three of them in different ways. I would say that the role of abduction is bigger in all of them than what's mostly acknowledged. This type of a process of sort of comparing, intermediate explanations, but induction and deduction, they're also very important. And but of course, it's easier to also sympathize with the fact that different schools of thought have suspicions and dogmatic beliefs and so on what we're supposed to be admitting that we're doing. And perhaps that's also, and there was a lot of talk in the comments on how to get published and what the journals want, as we discussed. So perhaps there is this distinction that the, like Robert Kaplan talked about, reconstructed logic and logic in use. So, the type of logic that we present in our argument, also perhaps, related to talk about Joya as well, that he's aesthetic to me is a reconstruction of a process of theorizing. So the data structure models that come out of there, and then different, academic groups and cults have different appreciation of these reconstructions. And some, but the word positivism is a little bit like classical music, that you need a term for the type of stuff that happens in a concert hall, and you can only get booze during the intermission. So you can't bring your booze to that, and you can't dance. But sort of, there's no such thing as so classicism was a period in Western history, but sort of, really the musics that are labeled underneath this label, there's really no good term actually. Sort of, concert music is not necessarily right, because you can hear that music in church, and many of these pieces, actually Bach's pieces, are dances, and sort of, it's right, like, but there's no good term, so people just give up and speak of classical music. So maybe it's a little bit similar with positivism, which is basically something that nobody would, or very few people would self-identify with anymore, but it's kind of comfortable.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm looking at Sumit's comments here. I'm afraid I don't understand this idea that ism solves something. Ontological assumption of positivism, interpretative solves this. So I'm sorry, I don't understand that. And the idea of linking bonded rationality to hermeneutics, I have trouble understanding that.
Yeah, well. I guess, why I raised so I think there's something that I read into this comment, which probably, say somebody like somebody who's very well versed in behavioral theory and so on, so they wouldn't think of bounded rationality in these terms. But sort of, I think there's a sentiment that I would subscribe to, which is that we have to interpret our data somehow, and
Yes.
that's what hermeneutics initially set out to do. So that's what for instance, Gadamer has a lot of interesting stuff to say when we think about inference to the best explanation. So I think basically, even though he doesn't use that term, a lot of his work is relevant there. But I think it's a bit of a bold move to move from bounded rationality to hermeneutics. So again, I included this sentence because I subscribe to the sentiment that everybody has to be somewhat comfortable with interpreting data. So there's no way of.
Absolutely. And as a statistician, I fully understand and acknowledge and endorse that idea.
Does the word model have a positivist connotation though, before we move on?
Was that model positivist connotation? Well, positivist in this sense, yes, because we have theoretical models and then we translate those into empirical models. So we take transaction cost economics and we turn it into a structural equation. Walker and Weber's classic article on the make or buy decision in the automobile industry, ASQ 1984. So I think that, quote unquote positivists maybe use models more than others. But again,
and then again, there are process models. So I don't think that Anne Langley would self-identify as a positivist, by a long shot. And sort of, she's, published and written a lot about process models. And there's a lot of process models that get published in qualitative research. Through interpretive work. So perhaps but is that's another debate for another day. Do they speak of the same thing? So is a model the same thing? I would say I would stick my neck out and to an extent say yes, that they are trying to accomplish something pretty similar, because process models also they have something that resembles a causal structure. It's just that there are feedback loops and there are but they're suggesting relationship between abstract concepts.
Yeah, and we're working on a manuscript on models, and in that manuscript, which hopefully will be finished one day, we actually make a distinction between theoretical models, empirical models, and data models.
Yeah.
So we casually speak of data sets, but maybe a better way of describing empirical material, it's a model of some kind. Okay, so the data set that a quantitative researcher has, it's being built. Okay, data are not collected. The data sets are built, and you're going to decide what variables to include, what not to include, how to choose the scaling for a given variable. What you're essentially doing, you're building a data model. And then we have empirical models like econometric models, and then we have theoretical models like transaction cost economics, agency theory, behavioral theory of the firm. So these are all models, but they're kind of models that operate at different levels. So the word model requires unpacking as well. So if we had 7 hours, we could go through. Okay, so let's move on. Let's talk about history. So there were a couple comments from Nicole. So what do you think?
I'm highly sympathetic to historical explanation. For me, history was, because it was maybe the first social science. In some, I don't know if Herodotus really considered himself as a scientist, but sort of, he was certainly, a historian in some sense. And sort of there's a great tradition of figuring out stuff that happens in social systems in historical research. So there's and I think that tradition is highly valuable and interesting. And indeed, we have seen special issues published, and we've seen you're even working on a historical process, project as far as I understand right now. Our friend and colleague Eero Vaara and Rudi Duran, they published a paper in SMJ, I think around 10 years ago, and sort of the types of contribution that that historical research could do to causal explanations in strategy. So I think there's a lot to be mined there, and historians have also, they have a lot to offer in terms of understanding how to interpret, all sorts of data sets.
Absolutely.
But I think the difference sometimes, that's a bit harder to reconcile with our field is that a historian often is happy if they're able to explain some key event. That, in books on history, so that they're much more empirical or also even in account. Explain might be even a too strong a word, but sort of give an account of, give a new account of historical event.
Absolutely.
And in our case, in our field, we often look for a more abstract type of an account of what happened. So just explaining a case isn't, in history, explaining a case already would be in some cases a huge contribution. If you explain the Cuban Missile Crisis or whatever, it's a huge contribution. And in our case, because we deal with more abstractions, perhaps that's where the tensions lie. But I would recommend reading the work of historians, how they approach. And also, I think they haven't talked about abductive reasoning, but sort of when you're going through that sort of material, so that's what you're really good at.
Absolutely,
Debating. Also, in Finnish history, sort of, about, say, President Kekkonen, who was a, near dictator in our own national history, sort of, he's, whenever somebody publishes a book, there's a huge public backlash when other historians are sort of bringing their own interpretations of why something happened. And I think that's a great example of, say, abductive reasoning and inference is the best explanation of what is really lovely. And then you see kind of, political passions come through, that what some people think of as lovely is not lovely to others.
Precisely, and this is where the IOE and IBE, the distinction becomes really central, that historians are not looking for that one only, they're looking for best explanations. And let me briefly describe, I'm currently working with two economic historians, Juha Antti Lamberg and Mirva Peltoniemi, and we are looking at an R&D alliance that lasted for almost 100 years. So this is in the Finnish pulp and paper industry, and the organization is KCL. It still exists today, if you want to. So it's essentially an R&D alliance that was founded in 1916 on the eve of Finland's independence from Russia. And then we chronicle. One of the things we do is we chronicle the development, the changes in the governance structures and in the institutional environments. We look at the gradual delegitimization of cartels, for instance. We look at what happened during the Second World War and when Finland joined the European Union. And it's been really fun to work with historians. And one of the things that I noticed, which is something that you just alluded to, was the ubiquitous use of abductive reasoning. It's detective work. And the nice thing with working with economic historians is that you can always go and get more data. So we have a Zoom conversation, and then I ask, I wonder if we could get the share registers from 1950 to 1970. And then Mirva or Juha Antti said, well, I'm going to go to the archives next week. So it's really cool when you can go. It's kind of like Sherlock Holmes. You can go and get more data. It's not just the thing that you've collected that you have to work with. And then as I'm looking at how this article is shaping, it's not an explanation in the sense that I, as an economist, but it's really an account of. And it's making sense of, what are we trying to make sense of? We're trying to make sense of how on Earth an R&D alliance could survive for almost 100 years. And in those 100 years, we have minor disruptions like the Second World War and Finland's joining of the European Union. So it's really, so would I consider emphasizing historic perspectives in org science? Emphatic yes. Absolutely. But also this paper has been kind of a marriage of historical methodology and then economic theorizing. So we bring in transaction cost economics into the conversation, and Elinor Ostrom's idea of managing the commons, managing a common resource.
I want to read that paper. That sounds cool.
Yeah. So absolutely.
Let me kind of take two things also linking back to our previous discussion. Kind of hearing you speak about that project makes me think of two things. First of all, the kind of the Feuerabend idea that anything goes in methodology, which for me is again, we're going to talk about relativism a bit later, but sort of that is not a relativist sentiment in the way that I understand it, because it's a sentiment that there's a lot of local practice specific knowledge in different fields of scholarship. And you're experiencing now sort of working with historians. I've also worked with Johan earlier. I'm a big fan of his work and the way that he approaches things and data sets. But then then sort of really that you kind of get a sense that they have a different way. They're kind of almost like a tacit set of assumptions and the practice and a skill set that's developed. Johan, he's around our age, so he's been doing this for, it was more than 20 years when he did his PhD, and sort of he was educated into going to the archive and sort of working with a certain, and that's anything goes if it's appropriate to what you're doing, and that's the thing. And the other thing is that also I'm thinking of our first discussion about doubt and sort of complex answers and so on. So I don't see, when you're talking about figuring stuff out, I don't see you as an anxious person sort of being tortured by how horrible it is not to know yet what the outcome is, but it's actually pretty fun, isn't it? Sort of doubt and the kind of the abductive process. So there is this kind of exhilarating aspect to it as well.
Absolutely. So let me just remember Alf mentioned in the webinar this inverted view relationship. So he mentioned Clifford Kurtz's work on the Balinese cockfights. So the idea that if you're totally ignorant of everything, you won't understand the first thing of what's going on. And then the other extreme, which is I guess equally disconcerting, would be to go full native. So the sweet spot is fine. So here's something, if you talk to Johan, you will see that first of all, he approaches the data and the questions with an incredibly full mind. Okay, so he's certainly not here, but he's not going native either. So he is an outside observer still to this. But I think that he has found the sweet spot. But when you talk to him about any data point, let's say that we're looking at the articles of incorporation, the things that he brings into the conversation come from a full informed mind.
I have a sort of super fun example of this, because I was commenting on a paper by a couple of colleagues, and it was a unique position from which I was commenting, because they had studied the Aalto University, which is a sort of a big university project in Finland that was politically somewhat contested, and sort of it was a major revision of the Finnish university sector. And I happened to be in the board of Aalto University from its inception to, I think I spent like 10 years almost in working in through this merger of 3 universities. And I had a couple of colleagues who had actually then done research on the merger, and were that the paper I believe was later published in the AMJ. But at one point I actually sort of was asked to comment on it, and sort of that's when you're full native, when you're a board member, when sort of you're basically your ass is committed to speak to what's happening, and sort of it was incredibly difficult not to say that I know that that's not right, but it's then the ultimate extreme of sort of you have to work very, very hard to have any kind of a distance from what you're reading. I think historical research in general, you have this challenge as well, often when you're reading about, say, your own nation, and you have certain political beliefs, and you have sort of certain commitments. And I think that's why we see, so historians are not neutral often, that they tend to be committed to certain types of political philosophies and so on, left or right, and sort of their interpretation of events. But when you have a good scientific community, then they can fight these out.
Exactly. Exactly. Very good.
So yay for history.
Okay. Then there's actually just one comment on This, you want, again, you're the resident philosopher. You want to?
Yeah, I lifted this for a particular reason because I think I just wanted to flag. Perhaps this is a commitment that you and I, Mikko, the one epistemological commitment that we do tend to make in a lot of our work, which I think is very Peircean. So it is very kind of pragmatist in sentiment, Peircean pragmatist, which is that knowledge is an evolving thing. So knowledge is something, and actually it goes against one of the tenets of positivism, which is verificationism, that
Yes.
For a statement to be meaningful, you need to be able to verify it. And sort of, and for instance, they were debating that the statement, there is a volcano on the dark side of the moon. I believe that was one of the thought experiments that they did, and they had no means in the early 20th century to go and find out. So, until the point where that statement could be verified, it actually was meaningless. So that was one of the implications, which it obviously from many perspectives it isn't. And sort of that was one, that wasn't the death blow to verificationism, but still it's a kind of the fallibilist idea is ultimately that what we have now, everything that we claim to know could turn out not to be the case, later on, sort of when our work evolves. And I guess, I would say there are very few things that you can know for 100% certainty from that perspective. So what we're delivering is an imperfect and uncertain thing, but we again we do our best to figure things out.
Yeah, and doesn't this go to all the way back to the philosophy 101 notion that I think therefore I exist? Wasn't that sentiment kind of an examination of what is it that we can know for certain? And then Descartes.
I am, cogito ergo sum. So that's Descartes, and it's actually sort of and say Nietzsche famously pushed back on that how come your existence is something that you can be certain about? How about sort of your will to power? Sort of will to, or Freud would say sexuality, and Deleuze and Guattari would sort of say well, I don't know what they would say, but they push back on both of these conceptions. But sort of still, but that's even that in a sense, that's seemingly almost like a tautological certainty that actually isn't. And it was presented at the aftermath of the 30 Years' War, where sort of Descartes was trying to find, arguably, Stephen Toulmin wrote a book called Cosmopolis.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, so where he's actually sort of locating that kind of the Cartesian sort of super cognitivist view of humanity into a particular time and place, which is fascinating. But anyway, so I just like to if I have to commit to an ism here, I would commit to fallibilism.
Okay, I agree, and I guess one thing. So what's the Monday morning? I always revisit the Monday morning test. What difference does it? I notice that young scholars tend to overplay their conclusions, because they sometimes seem to think that you have to express your conclusions with certainty, but that's not the case. That's not the case at all. Present your conclusions unapologetically, but not with by overplaying your hand. And the word verify, which we use in different meanings for philosophers, for positivists, it meant something very, very specific.
Yeah.
Okay. I might say, let me verify if I have any milk in the fridge. Well, we speak of verification casually, but verification in philosophy has meant something untenable and something that cannot be achieved. But will you find the word verify in the conclusions or discussion sections of articles? Oh yeah. Oh yeah, you will.
Yeah, so, and sort of when we go to more theoretical statements that are not specific to what's in your fridge, then sort of verification, it becomes a really, once you really think hard on it, it becomes a very, very hard thing to grasp how it could be possible. All right, loveliest explanation.
Loveliness. Let me
get a lot of loveliness.
everything here on on the page. So let's talk about loveliness. What a
Yeah,
lovely idea.
and this is about lenses, that you can apply different lenses to understanding. I think the conception of a lens is pretty compelling. That it actually goes back to your fish Schwinn example. Sorry, not Fisher, but
Yeah. So let me pick on the first Piyush's comment, lens and bias. Okay, so let me show you two sets of lenses. Okay, these lenses I use to if I need to look at something that's about 2 feet in front of me, the screen. And these are progressives that I use if I read something really close, or if I'm driving, for instance. Okay, so these are lenses, but these don't bias in any way. They bring something to focus. I would rather use that analogy metaphor here, that lens brings something to focus. To call it bias is misleading. I think it's misleading to me. It simply means that, okay, if I adopt this theoretical way of seeing, it brings some things to focus and then puts others in the periphery. I mean, but that's the whole point. But to describe it as bias, is, in my view, misguided.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Another great, and I really like it. That sort of really. So bias is, in the statistics, there's a particular
yes,
bias, which is a bit different than because in this case there's a positive aspect of seeing something clearly.
Yes, that's why focus is a better word. Yes.
Yeah, but another metaphor that I really enjoy is framing, which is something
framing.
Yeah, so that and say a lot of people nowadays have a digital camera in their phone, and I love taking photos when I'm on my evening walk. I actually sort of that's one of my practices of seeing the world, that I try to identify a compelling frame from what I see. And that's actually that's the essence. One of the key practices in photography is how you frame things, how you sort of compose. It's called composing a scene, and sort of what are the elements, and what we see around us is messy. I'm not just referring to my office, which is always messy, but nature also is very messy. But in the best landscape photographers, they're able to impose framing on what they're seeing, and it then deals a lot with how they compose a scene. So what's left out, what's taken in, and what's left out. Of course, there's things like lighting and everything else, and actually focus is also something that you use. You focus on certain things and you blur out certain other things if you're really good at that sort of thing. But I think that's another analogy that and in social science. And there are people who speak about framing, theoretical framing.
Oh, absolutely. And Herbert Simon in administrative behavior. I mean, he talked about the importance of in problem solving. The sentiment that problems don't exist out there. Problems become problems only after an active mind frames them as. And there are many ways, and this was Simon's point, there are many ways to frame any given problem, which will then lead to different proposals for solutions. And this is what design science is all about. It's about framing a problem and then engineering a solution to that framing. Really, really central. So, and I actually see that Nicole's last comment here, when you wear blue lenses, you see blue more clearly. I like that. So it brings something into focus, and then you see other things less clearly. But you made a very good point about bias, because I think that you hit the nail on the head. Why am I bothered with the word bias? Because in statistics, bias is generally a bad thing. When you have a biased estimate of a parameter, you're estimating something other than the parameter itself, and that's always a cause for concern. So, but we're not talking about that kind of bias here, that we're trying to do the right thing and then we end up doing the wrong thing.
Yeah, so that's good. So it's and there is no sort of perhaps a lens-free visual on our data. So there are commitments that we make And to the point, actually, what you said about data models, that sort of even the conception of raw data is pretty misleading. So I guess
yeah, I hate the notion of raw data.
Yeah.
That there's nothing raw about data. Data is very most data sets exhibit a very sophisticated and selective way of looking at something. Nothing raw about them. No, but it is we casually use the term raw data, obviously.
No.
Okay. Is there anything else here that merits attention?
I think we've touched upon these themes earlier. I think we should.
Okay. Lovely. So the next one is how many explanations?
Actually, this is continuation of the same, so I just gave it a little bit of a different title. So, there's this notion of strong versus weak inference that came from the natural science. It was published in the journal Science, I believe. Do you remember who the author was? I always forget.
Pratt or Platt.
Platt.
1960. Strong inference. Yeah. What was the idea of strong inference?
So it was just that sort of when you show that you entertain alternative explanations, it tends to be your reasoning is more solid. So it's stronger than if you didn't, if you just entertained one explanation.
Okay, and really crucial, really important here is that Platt actually presented a methodologically justified way of pitting theories against one another, but it involved something called the crucial experiment. And the crucial experiment would be something that would incorporate the competing theories, the competing hypotheses, and then the result of that crucial experiment would then credit some, maybe one, and discredit the others. But let's pause here and ask, is this feasible in our line of work? How many articles can we think of where a crucial experiment has been conducted? I can't think of a single one in our line of work.
Yeah, so obviously, the analogy from natural sciences, it's a bit tenuous, but I guess, it does raise the question of, there's this desperation that I can never entertain every explanation, and I can never even know every explanation. I was just talking to a neuroscientist colleague who told me that results in cartography, sort of mapping out lake beds from satellite data, is something that can be helpful in reading images of the brain. So I don't have any training to understand why, but I can understand the example, which is that, there's all sorts of ways where, and we have, in the history of science, all sorts of great, discoveries have come through this analogical transfer, that you're getting something from a different body of knowledge. And but I don't think this is something that we need to be desperate about. I think it's just that we can approach this with curiosity. And even though sort of there's somebody saying something about journals again in the end, Piyush is talking about pragmatic views to follow the dominant lens of the journal where you want to publish. I doubt that's the case for most of the journals where I've published, because it's not that journals have dominant lenses.
No, I can't think.
But of course, it's fair to say that there's a normal science in every field, and there are certain lenses that are going to be more popular and just recognizable than others, because of what's happening at the moment. However, if Mintzberg had adopted the dominant lens to studying strategy or leadership, I doubt that he would have the same career that he has now. So, there's all sorts of reasons why not to kind of just play it safe. So this is a pretty complex, and I would just, say that yes, it's impossible to entertain all, nearly all the possible explanations, and arguably lots of the explanations are not going to be very good ones or interesting ones. However, I think there's a lot to be said for us opening up our processes of reasoning, as we've discussed.
Absolutely. So let me just comment on the last thing. I'll just be brutally honest. The journals don't have dominant lenses. Not a single journal that I have been involved with. There's nothing even remotely resembling a dominant lens. Again, the journal is an organization that has editors, a dozen associate editors, and then possibly hundreds of editorial review board members and peer reviewers, that they would all subscribe to something called the dominant lens is just inaccurate. So don't think of journals as being monolithic. And there's certainly nothing to follow there, I think.
But yeah, so for me, it was eye-opening. I really liked the Saadami and Greed with the ASQ paper, Rhetorics for Legitimacy or something, 2010, I think, where they have a long methodology section, which has a lot of almost inductive looking coding, where they're presenting sort of, just kind of almost like frequencies on how they coded their data. But there's also a very sort of honest account of an encounter with a religious studies colleague who gave them, a major category from medieval philosophy that really explained the rhetorics that they were seeing. And I think that's shed light on aspects of it that they hadn't seen before. And it just encourages me to try to be more open to the interpretations of other students, trying to find, untypical examples, or sorry, not examples, but sorry, explanations, read stuff that, especially once you have tenure, that, really it's a great profession to be in, because, we can read whatever we want, and it's our job to do that.
Yeah.
So read philosophy, anthropology, and get access to, read aesthetics or and be, it's great to interact with people who are also not in our field, and find these cooler and more unorthodox ways of looking at things.
Yeah,
and I don't think underscore that nearly enough.
Yeah, and I think it was Herbert Simon who said that if you notice that a paradigm has gotten too tight of a hold of you, join the opposition for a while and see what happens.
Yeah,
So, and this is something that Joe Mahoney, who is my co-author and friend and organization economist, and we're working on a book together. And we're really.
Oh, you're working on a book? Where can I get it? How much does it cost? Do you have a link?
I'll let you know. I'll let you know. But so we just had a very, very good conversation last weekend about contracting, and so we have adopted this, what we call the efficiency lens. So we look at things, organizational phenomena, through the efficiency lens. And then one of the things we talked about last weekend was prisons. And the question of, private versus public prisons. And there came a point in the conversation where we both realized that maybe there are contexts, such as prisons, where we really need to give up efficiency. We need to take off the efficiency lenses and put on the lenses of integrity and fidelity of the organization. There's a very good, very disturbing documentary called Attica that came out in 2019. It is about an uprising, a riot in a correctional facility in upstate New York in Attica. It is horrible. I would describe it as a story that nobody wants to hear, but everybody should. So, and it is about an organization, a prison. And if you're compelled, watch, it's a Showtime, I think it's a Showtime or HBO documentary, but it is gut-wrenching. It is horrible. And if you think of what went wrong in that organization that left, among other things, several dozen people dead, both inmates and correctional officers. And then you think of how would you fix this organization? Efficiency, throw it out the window, and focus on what actually Williamson mentioned this as well. Focus on probity or integrity of the organization. If the organization doesn't have integrity, it is an insult to talk about efficiency. It's an insult. Okay.
That's super interesting.
Yeah. So let's see. Shall we talk about relativism?
Relativism, I guess it's just a term that So it's a complex term. So by relativism actually can mean a lot of different things. It's again sort of one of those isms that very few people self-subscribe to or self-identify with. It is kind of more like a bugbear or troll that's
Yeah.
used to scare young children, that there's a danger of relativism that lurks here. And for me, how I'm comfortable thinking about relativism, this is actually a very strong positive statement that you cannot find reasons why one view of the world is better than another.
Mm-hmm.
That for me is relative. That's sort of, it's all relative, and that's a very strong description of relativism, because there are all sorts of ways that you can use to compare. And going back to our loveliest explanation,
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
It's just that we have to accept that science is social. So I guess that with fallibilism, for me that there's this kind of a social epistemology that also comes with that sort of that we have also when you're working with your historian friends, and you're sort of working on a paper, if we were to expect that there's some sort of a transcendental a priori ground rule for methodology that can be always used to select between explanations. So if that's relativism, then I would say that it's very hard to refute that. But I think relativism is a much stronger assumption that it basically discounts the possibility of selecting between worldviews. So for me, it's a much more destructive idea.
Yeah. Well, I confess I don't understand what relativism. I've never had any use for it. To me, it doesn't pass the Monday morning test. So I'm just gonna. Can I just claim ignorance here, because I have no idea what's going on.
Feel free, but it's a word that gets thrown around, and
I know. Yeah.
And so the people who are scaring young children with it, I think, are often some kinds of naive realists who kind of feel that we have to have this religious belief that in some odd conception of outside reality, whatever. That's another metaphor, that's hard to understand. And if we somehow then appreciate the fact that that's actually very hard to define and grasp, then we become relativists and might as well vote for Trump, or sort of do whatever, believe in sort of misinformation and so on. And there's actually quite a long way from that assumption to the kind of the slippery slope that's being described. So
I guess my advice to young scholars would be, if you use any ism or ology, never assume that its meaning is understood. Never make that assumption. So don't talk about positivism, assuming that everyone understands exactly what it means. And I think relativism is in that same category. In general, maybe again, could we apply Occam's razor here? Talk about relativism only if you need it for something. Ask the question.
That's
why do I talk
as an
about
abstract entity? That's actually pretty cool. So only use those labels that you absolutely need to. And I think there is this assumption that somehow people have to have a philosophy section in their thesis.
I remember I was writing one into my dissertation, I think, and then my advisor says, "What the hell is this?" Okay. So I don't know. Am I being unkind if I say that writing about isms and ologies is cute? It can make you look ostensibly smart. As long as you don't ask any follow-up questions, I can throw these for us. I don't know.
Whatever. You don't read my thesis though, because I think that there might be a lot of that.
Yeah, I'm so happy my thesis can be found in a PDF. I think you actually have to go to the University of Minnesota library and find it. So anyway, Okay, so let's
It's
see.
going to be a pilgrimage. I'm going to do a little road trip and sort of go see Andy at the same time, and then sort of go find your thesis there. That's
Okay,
cool. Mine can be fine as a PDF. Just Google. I think it's even in my Google Scholar. So if you want to really have an entertaining afternoon, sort of go find
okay. But here's a word. Here's a word that is very important. So you've really stressed this in the webinar as well. So what do we need to understand about doubt?
Yeah, so doubt is generative, as Karen Locke and Karen Golden-Biddle and Martha Feldman wrote in that doubt science piece. I think that's a great, similar methodology piece, that really validates abduction as a good method, or sort of good reasoning tool in our toolkit. And sort of, it's not bad that we're confused. It's if we're worried, that's good. It's a part of, I think, when we talk about the values of a researcher, doubt should be, celebrated, and sort of, it should be nurtured, and it should be cultivated. And I believe actually sort of I have some colleague who was working on this as well. I just forget who they are. So one of the smart ones, maybe you or maybe not, but there are people who are sort of actually looking into doubt as a methodological principle. So I would certainly, I appreciate the type of stuff that you and I do. This is our a typical response, and when we try to publish in a journal, there's always a response that, would you please give us 10 rules of thumb for PhD students? So how, and this kind of thing that because it's uncomfortable, and that there are sort of these acts of kindness that are necessarily ultimately not that kind, which is to
yes, that's a good way of putting it. Absolutely. Yeah, can you Piyush writes, we need to learn to live comfortably with confusion. I think that's a nice way of expressing the sentiment that I'm confused about a lot of things, such as relativism, but with the hand on my heart, I can say that I am much less confused now than I was 25 years ago. But one of the reasons for that is because I let myself be confused. And then I said, you just lean into the wind, and I think that the confusion will clarify. But the way it won't clarify is if you just simply start accepting simple rules and then use those as guidance as you do your research and write your manuscript. So I think that living comfortably with confusion is, I think that's a good prescription.
It's what we do. It's like, I don't know, for me, a good day of research is when I have a meeting, several hours meeting with co-authors to try to figure out what our story is. So we're doing a revision, or not even a revision, sort of we're working with data, and so we're trying to figure out what this is. And sort of, it's sometimes super frustrating, and so I'm pacing, and I'm sweating, and I'm drinking too much coffee, and I'm sort of, sometimes I feel hopeless that there's no way that sort of we can crack this. So I have nothing to contribute, and I'm stupid, and sort of, I have all these emotions. Maybe I'm getting old, that my brain can't do this anymore. But then, and sometimes you get the bear, and then sort of sometimes you then get it, and it's what we do. But if we, just there's all sorts of easy ways to put lipstick on a pig, to kind of land on the easiest explanation, where you have some evidence of, and then kind of retrofitting the model to, if it's a process model, for instance, to then kind of do service to that. Or so that we've all tried to do that, I think, and failed. At least I have.
Yeah. So embrace doubt. Doubt. It's I think that's a good prescription. Okay, let's talk about the blank slate.
Yeah, if anybody has read any of our papers, I think they know that we don't really enjoy the metaphor of a blank slate.
Blank slate. It is again, it's a metaphor. Full slate is a metaphor. Blank slate is a metaphor. But what could we say about this that we didn't?
I think it's actually great that it comes after the previous one, because there in the sentiment of the blank slate, I think the one that's salvageable is the part, or this flavor that's salvageable is the sentiment. You shouldn't commit too early to an explanation. So you should entertain doubt. You should sort of have, but I think it's such a category mistake to assume that this is something that you do if you have an empty mind. Because what do you have doubt about if you don't have anything to work with? So anyways, it's kind of it's a funny, but I do sort of the sentiment. There's something in the sentiment that I think we can salvage, but otherwise I think it's a pretty destructive assumption. It leads to a lot of misunderstanding, and it actually has been damaging to I've seen people whose careers it has, or well, if not careers, at least there are the papers and PhDs that sort of we see candidates who somehow taken the wrong message, and then just there are models that are presented as theoretical models that have nothing to do with the literature. So how can that be a theoretical model if it isn't connecting with anything?
Yeah, so I think this maybe a distinction between the slate and whether it's full or not. So and let's distinguish that from the idea of committing to something. Okay, so let me describe. About 10 years ago, I had weird symptoms in my hip. Okay, and I went to generalist and I went to specialists. And all of them seem to approach the question with a full mind. Okay, so these are experienced, trained. I always like to go to experienced physicians. But the difference between good and bad physicians and those who were able to help me and those who weren't was at what point did they commit to a diagnosis? The bad ones committed immediately. The better ones said, okay, let's examine this. Okay, so I think that this idea of have a full mind, but sit on the fence, do not commit.
What Alf actually says here that
exactly,
yes, a full slate with lots of theories, but hold them loosely, I guess.
Exactly.
So don't overcommit. Yeah, I think your medical example is great, because we all have this fear of a trigger happy doctor who sort of will operate on somebody's back, even though it's going to do more harm than good. Kind of going against the Hippocratic Oath, just quite simply because they have a hammer and they use it, or inject you with cortisone rather than
that was and then I went to another doctor who was kind of also, and he said, I would give you a cortisone shot as well, but this guy gave you 10 times of what I would give you. 10 times. He gave you a dose I would give to a horse. Okay. So, and well, neither of these shots actually worked. They did nothing to me. So this was these physicians had full minds and highly trained and experienced, but they clearly had committed. First of all, they had committed to the idea that the reason, that the root cause for my pain is where the pain is.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's a hasty inference, I think, hasty abduction. Okay, if that's where it hurts, that's where the problem is. But maybe that's just a symptom. Okay,
yeah, sure.
So anyway, but yeah, so and Alf's last name here is not blurred because just like Andy, I think here the person's identity matters. So, and this I think also resonates with the Gertz example that Alf mentioned. So
yeah, because they wrote a paper on abduction which we recommended. So it's
yes, important. AMR, is it 21 or 22?
Yeah, and there are, apologies if there are others whose papers we haven't read and who we don't recognize. So this is just, our limited library that's in our heads, the people that we happen to
I appeal to bounded rationality.
Okay, you do? Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
I appeal to old age.
Okay.
So you want to do this, I think this is for you.
This one is to me.
Yeah, so the discussion, I think you had a little email discussion with Alf afterwards about AI
The
and stuff.
difference between being human and AI is the ability to identify bicycle.
Remember the captcha thing?
Yeah. So I'll send an email later and say this was in jest, but there is something that really merits attention here. So what is CAPTCHA? So what is it? It's a completely automated Turing machine something thing to tell people that CAPTCHA. So everyone has to prove that they're human beings. So what's the logic there? The idea is to give you a task, is to devise a task that a human being can solve effortlessly, but an algorithm cannot. And that's a really interesting. So what can human beings do that computers can't? And I actually have a colleague here in Madrid who does work on AI, and we had lunch about a month ago, I think, and she said that, because I said, what are the things that, because I said, okay, so I study reasoning and I make this distinction between computational and cognitive, and I said, can you give me examples of simple situations where algorithms fail? And she said, crossing the street. Would you trust AI to tell you when it's safe to cross the street? And she said, don't do that. Because as you're thinking of, okay, let's say there's a busy street and you need to get across to the other side. Well, what are all the things they have to take into account? And you know that if you make a mistake, the consequences might be devastating. So self-driving cars. So this is I've also worked with some people at Ford. And this challenge of self-driving, many of these conversations evolve around what is it that artificial intelligence can and can't. We know that artificial intelligence can beat the socks off of any chess player. Okay. And now the interesting question is which chess algorithm is better than. So we have all these, but human beings have lost. I think it was back already 30-20 years ago when Big Blue was playing Kasparov and they were kind of head to head. So this idea of identifying bicycles. So suppose that we show you a photograph, not of a bicycle, but just a very small part of a bicycle, but it is in a context. It's presented, maybe someone's about to walk across the crosswalk. So the human mind infuses meaning that the algorithm just doesn't see. Okay, so this idea of, I hate the word holistic, but I'll use it anyway. And isn't abduction sometimes described as holistic reasoning, in the sense that who was the person that
I think it comes from the study of cognitive science, but it was Jerry Fodor who talks about
that's
about holism. And actually that's a really interesting thing, is that sort of, if you think about that, the abductive reasoning as a process of search, how far is the search? And this even sort of, once you get deep and philosophical with this, the meaning of terms, you can't actually, limit the size of the search where sort of, you find sort of say synonyms, or you find stereotypes or whatever to understand the meaning of a term. So in basic semantics, you have the same kind of a challenge. But so that's the whole holism in abduction. So and it kind of has very going out to lunch with a colleague to figure out your research. That's one way to appreciate the holistic nature of search, that there might be a really good explanation that's unexpected to you, that incorporates a base of knowledge that you don't yet possess, because you're not an expert in that.
I want to show a picture, because this is something that I show in my in one of my seminars. So here's a photograph that I show in my seminar, PhD seminar. Another shameless plug here. So here is a street corner with an ambulance, and a police car, and then a bunch of people. And a very simple question: what do you think happened here? What do you think happened here? So now the question is, what do we pay attention to? Okay, so has somebody been injured? Well, the ambulance is there, so maybe someone's been injured. Well, there's a police car there, so maybe a crime has been committed. But then when I showed this to a friend, he said, "Oh, that's 9th Avenue and 48th Street, Midtown, New York. I've lived a couple blocks from here." So then I asked him, "Is there a hospital nearby?" And he said, "I don't think there's a hospital nearby." So, and then one student saw a fire hydrant in the picture and said, "Well, the fire hydrant isn't being used, therefore." And then another student asked, I have a hard time telling whether that ambulance is moving or not. So see how all these things that are kind of in the picture and yet aren't in the picture are being incorporated as we're trying to solve the mystery. What do we think happened here? So this is abductive reasoning in a very real, practical sense. And what makes it holistic is that there are so many things that we could incorporate. Maybe a police car is there because in the US, if something happens, the cops tend to show up always. But if this happened in Finland, let's say someone slipped and fell and an ambulance came, the chances are that the cops wouldn't show up. Because in Finland, it's not customary that the police always show up when something happens. But in the US, it's actually fairly common. So I think this reveals to me something essential about abductive reasoning.
Cool. I think we've exhausted the chat. We've spent another 2 hours on this.
We exhausted the chat and ourselves. Yeah, we are at about 2 hours. It's been a wonderful conversation, I think, and I hope this is useful. I hope that we were able to address the remaining questions and concerns. And let's consider maybe another webinar on, so what does this mean for doctoral education? I think that could be a useful thing here. So I want to thank you, Saku. I want to thank the participants, Ivarat, for setting things up. And I'll leave the last word to you. How do you want to wrap this up?
I had a really funny joke in the seminar that you wanted edited out, but my mind is empty. I think we have covered a lot of ground here, and then just my appreciation for the organizers. It's a wonderful community, and I guess maybe a sentiment to share that we all have stories of how COVID has messed up our lives in different ways. So I'm sure that sort of a lot of us have experienced a lot of trauma during COVID. But one of the really great things that has happened is that we are now conversant with these technologies and we're able to meet this way. So have a conversation with scholars across the globe, and this isn't something that was present in my life before COVID. So we would always travel, and this is wonderful. So,
wonderful. That's a good note to end this on. So thank you again, and we will see you in the near future.
Okay, thank you.